I still remember the way the crystal glasses caught the candlelight that night in Berlin, May 10th, 1945, 2 days after Germany's unconditional surrender. And I, Sergeant James Walker, 3rd Army, had no business being in that room. But I was there, standing against the wall in full-dress uniform, one of a handful of enlisted men selected to serve as aides during the most surreal diplomatic dinner of the entire war. White linen tablecloths, silver cutlery that had survived the bombing by being hidden in some rich German cellar, American generals, British generals, French generals, and Soviet generals, all seated around the same table for the first time since the shooting stopped. I had crossed France with Patton. I had slept in frozen foxholes outside Bastogne. I had watched men I loved get buried in Belgian soil. And now here I was, holding a serving tray in a bombed-out Berlin mansion, while men with more stars on their shoulders than I could count toasted the end of the deadliest war in human history. I thought the hard part was over. I was wrong. The Soviet general was a large man, broad through the shoulders, chest covered in medals that caught the light every time he moved. He had the face of someone who had seen things that permanently rearranged the architecture behind his eyes. I did not know his name then. I learned later he was attached to Zhukov's staff. He rose to make a toast. I watched General Patton across the room as the interpreter began to translate. Patton was sitting perfectly straight, the way he always sat, like a man who had decided years ago that slouching was a form of surrender. His expression was unreadable to most people. I had been around him long enough to read it. He was listening very carefully. The Soviet general spoke for perhaps 2 minutes. The interpreter translated in pieces. The words were technically complimentary. He praised American industry, American equipment, American logistical capacity. He said that the United States had supplied the Allied cause with remarkable material resources. Then came the part that made every American officer in the room find sudden interest in his dinner plate. He said, with diplomatic smoothing that did not fully conceal the temperature underneath, that American fighting men had not experienced the kind of sustained, grinding, close-quarters combat that had forged the Red Army's toughness over 4 years on the Eastern Front. The implication was surgical and deliberate. You built good machines. Your men did not fight a real war. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with respect. I looked at the American generals. Several of them were looking at their plates. One was studying the pattern on his fork with intense concentration. The British officers maintained expressions of careful neutrality that had probably taken years of diplomatic training to perfect. Then I looked at Patton. He had set down his glass. He was straightening in his chair, and I felt my stomach drop, because I knew that posture. Every man in the 3rd Army knew that posture. It was the posture that preceded something that was going to be talked about for a very long time. He caught my eye across the room. One look, brief, direct. The order wasn't spoken. It didn't need to be. 2 years of serving under George S. Patton had calibrated me to his communications in a way that went beyond words. The look said, "Pay attention, remember everything, this matters." I set down my tray. I stood straight against the wall. I remembered everything. What Patton did next was not in any diplomatic briefing. It had not been approved by SHAEF. It was not the carefully managed response that the occasion technically called for. He stood up, in a room full of Soviet generals who had spent 4 years fighting the largest land war in human history, in a city that their army had just finished capturing at a cost of 81,000 Soviet soldiers killed in the final assault alone. General George S. Patton of the United States 3rd Army stood up and began to speak. He began by agreeing. This was the first surprise, not just to the Soviets, to every American in the room. He said, directly and without irony, that the Red Army had fought a war of extraordinary duration and sacrifice. He said that 4 years on the Eastern Front had produced a category of military experience that no other theater of the war had replicated. He said he had studied the Eastern Front with professional care, and he understood what it had cost, and that cost was deserving of every tribute history could assign it. He said this like he meant it, because he did mean it. I had heard Patton talk about the Eastern Front before, in the evenings when he gathered his senior staff and worked through operational problems the way other men worked through card games. He had genuine professional respect for what the Red Army had endured and accomplished. He was not performing respect in that Berlin dining room. He was stating a fact he had already reached on his own. The Soviet general who had made the toast nodded, apparently satisfied that the American had accepted the premise. Then Patton made the turn. He said that the Third Army, in 11 months of continuous operation from August 1st, 1944 to May 8th, 1945, had advanced further and faster against organized German resistance than any comparable force in the history of armored warfare. Not the history of the Second World War, the history of armored warfare entirely. He began citing numbers: 600 miles advanced, 181,000 square miles of enemy-held territory liberated, approximately 750,000 German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured, 12 countries involved in Third Army operations at various points during the advance, and then the number that changed the temperature of the room: 21,441 Americans killed in action. He said it the way he always spoke about his dead, without softening, without rhetorical decoration, with the precision of a man who had tracked every single name and carried every single one of them as a personal weight. 750,000 German casualties, 21,441 Americans killed. The mathematics hung in the air above the white linen and the crystal glasses like something that had physical presence. The Soviet general who had made the toast was no longer nodding. Then Patton said the sentence that I have carried with me every day for the rest of my life. He said, "My men were not fighting a lesser war. They were fighting a faster one." I have thought about those words across the decades since that night. A faster war demands a different kind of soldier than a longer one. The soldier who holds a city block for 200 days in conditions of starvation and artillery fire develops something real and permanent and almost incomprehensible to anyone who wasn't there. The Red Army soldier who survived Stalingrad had been forged into something that civilian life could barely contain. I do not diminish that. No honest person can, but the soldier who covers 60 miles in 72 hours develops something different. He develops a tolerance for not knowing where his flanks are. He develops the capacity to make decisions with incomplete information in conditions where waiting for clarification means the opportunity dies before the authorization arrives. He develops an institutional trust in his own motion. The understanding, built by months of experience, that forward is safer than stationary, because stationary means you can be found and fixed and destroyed, while forward means you are already somewhere the enemy didn't expect you to be. I was one of those soldiers. I didn't know that's what I had become until Patton named it in Berlin. The German generals had a name for what we did. They called it Bewegungskrieg, war of movement. They believed they had invented it. What they discovered in the summer of 1944 was that we had learned it and were executing it at a tempo their command structure could not process. General Alfred Jodl, the senior operational officer of the entire German armed forces, testified after the war that the single most damaging factor the Wehrmacht faced in the Western theater was not American material weight, not Allied air power, but the speed of Third Army's advance, which moved faster than German command could assess and respond to, faster than they could think. This was what Patton had built. I had watched him build it. I had watched him relieve officers who waited. I had watched him promote officers who moved. I had watched him stand in front of his army in the dust of French roads and explain, with a clarity that made complex things simple, that an army in motion is hard to kill, and an army standing still is already half defeated. He didn't build that army with speeches, he built it with standards, with expectations, with the daily, relentless communication that in this army, the officer who sees the opportunity and waits for permission is the officer who has failed, and the officer who sees the opportunity and moves is the officer who wins. By the time we reached Berlin, by the time I was standing against that wall holding a serving tray, I had internalized that principle so completely that it had become something like an instinct. The Soviet general did not respond immediately after Patton sat down. This was noted by every American officer in the room, and I can tell you from where I was standing that it was noticed with something close to stunned disbelief. Soviet generals at these gatherings were not accustomed to having their assessments challenged. They were certainly not accustomed to the challenge arriving in the form of specific numerical data delivered by an American who clearly knew Eastern Front casualty figures at least as well as they did. The silence lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. Patton picked up his glass and took a drink. He did not look satisfied. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a man who had stated something accurate and was willing to wait for the room to process it. 3 weeks later, I was present for a different kind of moment. A Soviet military review in Frankfurt, June 7th, 1945. American officers attended as guests. After the ceremony, as the formal lines of the event began to dissolve into the irregular conversations of officers who had finished the same war from different sides, Marshal Georgy Zhukov himself crossed the room toward Patton. Zhukov was, by any measure, one of the greatest military commanders of the 20th century. He had led Soviet forces through Stalingrad, through Kursk, through Operation Bagration, and through the final assault on Berlin. He had broken the German army. He had earned every medal on his chest at a price that most Western officers could not fully comprehend. He approached Patton with what I can only describe as professional curiosity. Through his interpreter, he said that he had reviewed Third Army's operational record and found it impressive in its tempo. He asked how Patton had maintained supply discipline at the rates of advance the record showed, because this was the question that every Soviet officer who examined the Third Army record eventually arrived at. They understood fighting, they understood suffering, they understood mass and firepower and the terrible arithmetic of attrition. What they could not understand was how an army moving at 60 miles per day kept itself fed, fueled, and armed, because in Soviet doctrine that was functionally impossible. Patton told him that he had threatened every supply officer in his army with relief of command if they fell more than 48 hours behind the forward elements. Zhukov considered this. Then he said, and I heard it through the interpreter standing 2 feet from where I stood at attention. In the Red Army, we would have shot them. Patton smiled. He said, I found threats sufficient. Zhukov looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once with the precise, deliberate nod of a man extending genuine professional respect to someone he had just finished taking the measure of. It was the most honest exchange I witnessed in those weeks of formal dinners and diplomatic performances. 2 generals who had fought the same enemy from different directions, acknowledging across all the distance of language and ideology and experience that they recognized something in each other. I have lived with the memory of that Berlin dinner for longer than most of the men in that room have been dead. I had crossed France and Belgium and Luxembourg and Germany with the Third Army. I had watched boys I trained with in the Mississippi heat get killed in the Belgian snow. I had driven supply convoys through roads under artillery fire because falling behind was not an option that Patton's army recognized as a category. And I had wondered, the way young men in war wonder, whether what we were doing mattered, Whether the speed, the exhaustion, the grinding relentlessness of always moving and never stopping and never waiting for the situation to clarify itself. Whether it was building something real or just building casualties at a different location. Patton's answer in Berlin was the answer I had been waiting for without knowing I needed it. We were not fighting a lesser war. We were fighting a faster one. The Red Army's sacrifice was real and vast and permanent in history. 27 million Soviet dead are not a number that any honest accounting can minimize or set aside. They paid a price for victory that stains the pages of any history book with the weight of it. But sacrifice is not the same as efficiency. And efficiency, the capacity to destroy the enemy at the lowest possible cost to your own force, to convert your soldiers' lives into enemy defeat at the best ratio your system can produce. That is the measure by which professional armies honestly evaluate themselves. Patton had built a system optimized for that efficiency. He had built it by promoting the officers who moved and relieving the officers who waited. He had built it by decentralizing decision-making to the level where decisions actually needed to be made. He had built it by treating supply as a tactical problem rather than an administrative one. By holding his logisticians to the same standard of performance he held his combat commanders. And the evidence that the system worked did not come from American sources, which might be suspected of institutional pride. It came from the Germans. Jodl said it at Nuremberg. Von Manteuffel, who fought the Eastern Front for 3 years before facing Patton in the Ardennes, wrote in his post-war assessment that the relief of Bastogne was the most impressive feat of operational execution he observed on the Western Front, measured against available resources and time constraints. And it came from the Soviets. A classified Soviet General Staff study completed in 1947 and not released until after 1991 assessed Third Army's advance rate as exceeding Red Army operational norms for comparable force compositions by a factor of approximately 2 to 1. Twice the speed their own doctrine held achievable. The enemies, looking at what Patton built from both sides, reached the same conclusion. The Soviet general who made the toast that night in Berlin never publicly responded to Patton's rebuttal. His silence, in the moment after the interpreter finished and the room waited for his answer, was the most honest assessment available. There was nothing to argue with. Not the numbers, not the method, not the conclusion. Patton sat back down, picked up his glass, and did not say another word about it. He had made the argument once, with precision, with data, without anger, and without apology. That was enough. He did not need the argument to be accepted. He needed it to be accurate, and it was. I am an old man now, and the wars I have carried in my body and in my memory are settled into something quieter than they once were. But I have never forgotten what Patton's look across that Berlin dining room asked of me. Pay attention. Remember everything. This matters. I have tried to honor it. The lesson he demonstrated that night, not just stated, but demonstrated with 11 months of operational proof stacked behind every word, is not a military lesson only. It is this. Suffering is not the measure of quality. Results are. The person who endures the most is not automatically the person who has performed best. The organization that has paid the highest price is not automatically the organization that has done the best work. The measure of excellence is not the depth of the wound you absorbed. The measure of excellence is how efficiently you converted your effort into the outcome you were trying to achieve. Patton's Third Army endured enough. It paid in blood. 21,441 names on that ledger are not an abstraction. I knew some of them. I watched some of them die. The cost was real, but the system he built converted that cost into results at a ratio that the most rigorous military analysts from the opposing side, the people with no motive for flattery, assessed as historically unprecedented. That is what excellence looks like. Not the deepest wound, the best result, The room in Berlin was quiet for a long moment after Patton finished and sat back down. That silence was the answer. I have been thinking about it ever since. Like, share, and subscribe for more explosive true war stories and untold history moments. James Walker served as a staff aide with the United States Third Army from August 1944 through the German surrender in May 1945. He was present at the Berlin Victory Dinner on May 10, 1945.